Thank you so much, Alisa, for the invitation and the kind introduction. It's really my pleasure to be part of this very important project, I will say, rebalancing democracy and capitalism. I think this is a very critical time in the history of globalization and in the society. And I hope this project will contribute to finding some solutions. So, in my brief reflections today, I will start by making some observations about the project, democracy, capitalism, to provide some context. And then I will focus on my recent paper in the Leiden Journal of International Law, which critiqued five mandatory human rights due diligence laws in Europe. And I will try to highlight the potential of HRDD as a concept, what limitations HRDD has, and then I also talk about how could we make HRDD more effective, and I will have some concluding observations at the end where we should be going. So I think that's how I wish to proceed. If you did not have a chance to read the paper, I will encourage you to read. It's an open access article which is available, but hopefully we can have some discussion as well after I finish my initial observations. So let me start with democracy and capitalism, so observations about the project. I completely agree that both democracy and capitalism are facing a huge crisis at this particular point of time. Perhaps we don't really have democracy anywhere in the world. Rather, I will call it we have a capitalist democracy. If we look at the major democracies in the world, whether it is the US or even my own country, India, corporate power is so much entrenched in the idea of democracy. It is almost impossible for poor middle class politicians to win elections at any point of time. Whether it is a presidential system of democracy or a parliamentary system of democracy, without the power of money, you can't really contest and win the elections. So the idea of democracy that we often think is with the people, that is hardly there. So in that sense, definitely we are facing a huge crisis. At the same time, I would like to mention that whatever we are discussing today is not that new. We had historically in the past businesses and corporations during the colonial period controlling whatever forms of governance we had, whether it was democracy, whether it was a system of monarchy, corporate power was playing a tremendous role. If you read the book by historian The Anarchy by William Dalrymple, he outlines how British East India Company exploited the Indian subcontinent, people, and natural resources. And of course, this British East India Company was acting as an agent of the Queen of England at that particular point of time. So the challenges that we see about capitalism or globalization for that matter, or democracy for that matter, these are not new challenges in my view, only the flavor and perhaps the extent of the challenges is new. But otherwise, those issues have been there with us for many, many years. Now, let us talk about the terminology, rebalancing. I wonder, and I would be curious to hear what Alisa and other colleagues who are running this project think, but I wonder whether rebalancing will be enough. I personally believe that if we have to fix the current crisis, we may need to dismantle the current ideas of capitalism completely. Many of the structures they can't be rebalanced enough, in my view, to fix the fundamental root causes of the problem. So perhaps we need more than rebalancing going forward if we have to fix this. I also wonder, though, whether we are expecting companies and businesses to do much more than in saving democracy. Can they really save democracy? Can businesses really save capitalism? And I have my doubts. So I believe that if we are expecting companies and businesses to save democracy, perhaps we are expecting them to do too much. Or in the process of saving the democracy, they might create a new form of democracy which is not going to serve the people but serve them ultimately. So perhaps we need to reclaim democracy, and that reclaiming project, I don't think we should give that much space and power and potential to businesses to do that. These are my initial observations about the crises that we are facing, and of course this project. But happy to talk more about these later. Now let me move on to the potential of human rights due diligence. And in my paper, I talk about that HRDD has become the lingua franca in this particular field. And perhaps that is the single most contribution of UN guiding principles, proposing this idea of human rights due diligence by which businesses can know and show how they respect all internationally recognized human rights. At the same time, it will be not fully accurate to assume that UN guiding principles or late Professor John Ruggie, that he created this concept of HRDD or human rights due diligence out of nowhere. If we look at the draft UN norms, which many people don't talk about or they're completely forgotten, and if you look at the commentary of the draft UN norms, some of the elements of HRDD was already there in this document of 2003. So, of course, there is no acknowledgement that UN guiding principles build to some extent on some ideas which were already there and proposed by Professor David Weisbrot, again, a late Professor David Weisbrot. Uh, but I think, in my view, that is something we should acknowledge. Or we may also look at a paper written by Margaret Young in 2006 for the Danish Institute for Human Rights when she was part of that. And she later on also became a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So she also talks about, interestingly, in that paper that she wrote in 2006 about this idea of due diligence. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that it is definitely not controversial that HRDD is a creation of UN guiding principles. But what I would like to stress here is that HRDD concept was somehow evolving even pre-UN guiding principles. So we should not see this, that it was just parachuted by Professor John Ruggie out of nowhere. It was there in the BHR discourse even before that. Now, in terms of the potential of HRDD as a concept, as a process, as a tool, in my paper, I talk about three critical positives or contribution that this concept can make. First is socialization. Second is common currency. And third is prevention. In terms of socialization, I think the beauty of HRDD is that businesses can relate to this idea. They already have been doing due diligence for many, many years in the corporate commercial context. So whenever anyone would like to talk about to companies that, okay, you just have to do due diligence, but of course, in the context of human rights, they perhaps feel more comfortable with this terminology. Of course, you may argue that that is also counterproductive, and I've written about this as well, that using a terminology which is business friendly is also problematic from a human rights normative perspective, but that is a separate point. Socialization was definitely a key contribution, and now everyone is talking about this. So second is the common currency. Now, before UN guiding principles, there was hardly one currency in the BHR discourse where everyone is talking about this, right? Let us take even today's webinar. So we are talking about whether we can rebalance and how do we rebalance capitalism and democracy. And we are still talking about HRDD, whether this can achieve that goal or not. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that from the governments to businesses to investors, CSOs, trade unions, to social movements, UN agencies, whether we like it or we don't like it, HRDD has become the common currency. Everyone, whether even if we are critiquing it, we are critiquing that particular concept. The third is prevention. HRDD definitely has some potential, in my view, to prevent, at least in some cases, if not in all cases, the abuses of human rights by businesses. So that potential is definitely there. If businesses follow HRDD properly, if they do meaningful consultation with affected stakeholders, so that can definitely be achieved. The prevention role can definitely be achieved. Now, of course, HRDD in Pillar 2 of the UN Guiding Principles is a voluntary concept in the sense that it is not a legally binding obligation. It is merely a responsibility. It is rooted in this idea of social expectation. And I think that is where this idea and push for legalization of HRDD is considered more relevant, because many companies did not really do what they should be doing in terms of Pillar 2. There was nothing surprising here. Again, uh, when people were celebrating around 2012, 2013 UN guiding principles, several colleagues and I, with Professor David Bilches, I co-edited a volume in which we critique the UN guiding principles. And of course, that was a heated discussion also, including with Professor John Ruggie, whether we got it right or not. But I think if we look fast forward now, I think some of the criticism that we made in 2012, 2013 about UNGPs has proved to be true. And one of those critiques was that the lack of bindingness of Pillar 2 is going to be a key factor which is going to undermine this idea of responsibility to respect human rights. And I think that's where we see the push for legalization. But if we carefully analyze the legalization trend, mostly within Europe, that is unfolding, we should also understand that what those countries or even the directive at the European Union level, they're trying to legalize. They're trying to legalize HRDD. They're not legalizing the responsibility to respect human rights. So I would like to make a distinction between making the responsibility to respect legally binding and making merely HRDD legally binding. Because HRDD is merely a process. And the responsibility to respect human rights is the key principle. It is the foundational principle. HRDD is merely one of the many ways in which businesses can discharge their responsibility to respect human rights. Of course, UNGPs pay most attention to HRDD as that tool, but at the same time, it is not the only tool by which they can do it. We should also be mindful that when we're talking about legalization, who is doing it? States are doing it. And when we talk about states, this is Pillar 2, not Pillar 2. So, sorry, this is Pillar 1, not Pillar 2. So states have a duty under Pillar 1. And if you analyze Pillar 1, it hardly talks about HRDD. It is mentioned in Pillar 1 only at in isolated places, one or two places, incidentally. So Pillar 2 is the HRDD process, and that's where it is voluntary. So here, what we see is that Pillar 1 is trying to make legally binding Pillar 2. But Pillar 1 can be much broader than just focusing on HRDD. But at this point of time, we are just thinking that what states can do is merely legalize HRDD, which is, in my view, a mistake. So similar to 2012, when everyone was celebrating human rights due diligence, I was writing and arguing that Pillar 2 will fail. And now we're talking about now the failure of Pillar 2, the voluntary failure of Pillar 2, and we're talking about legalization. And now we are celebrating the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. And my prediction now is that perhaps we should have another webinar 10 years from now. But my prediction is that this legalization again is going to fail. It will not deliver many substantive changes, real changes in the lives of the workers or other communities on the ground, and why it will not do it. So that allows me to now move on to the limitations of HRDD as a process. So in my paper, I focus on three limitations: conceptual, operational, and structural. And let me highlight some of these limitations. So I start with the conceptual one. So as many of you would appreciate, HRDD is merely a process. And there is a key distinction between the process and the outcome. Because a process, even if it is followed meaningfully, it may not achieve certain outcomes. And the outcome here that we're talking about is that businesses respect human rights. In addition to that, you can also see that Pillar 2 is merely about respecting human rights. But in my view, Pillar 2 also includes some elements of protection of human rights, especially in relation to the supply chains and the business partners. But Pillar 2 does not call it protect elements of responsibility to respect human rights. So Pillar 2, in my view, is conflating respecting human rights with protecting human rights. And that conceptual conflation is problematic, especially when we're trying to legalize HRDD, because a soft HRDD under Pillar 2 can be very wide, but when you're trying to legalize it, it has to be very precise and narrow. And then you can't really expect a company to ensure that everyone respects human rights without any limits in its entire supply chains globally. And then you also attach this idea of remediation to that. The other conceptual difficulty I find with Pillar 2 is that they talk about identification. There's nothing wrong with that. But then prevention and mitigation is often used together. So a company should identify and then prevent and mitigate. And that clubbing of prevention and mitigation together sometimes may create this misimpression, at least, that as long as a company can mitigate, it is fine to proceed. And some human rights adverse impacts are kind of inevitable. They are part of doing business anyway, because you're at least identifying and mitigating. So you don't need to completely prevent. Mitigation will allow you the license to operate. Now let me move on to the operational difficulties. And I think this is a key issue as far as I'm concerned, because HRDD process hardly address the various power imbalances that are there. So we are talking about businesses or business consultants or some other external parties, let us say Big Four, doing HRDD for companies, but without addressing power imbalances. Merely because the affected communities are sitting on the table with you as part of the consultation, it does not mean that they are not having the power imbalances. So the crucial thing is the power imbalances about information, legal aid, their issues about poverty. Are these issues addressed or not? And in most cases, those power imbalances are not addressed either by Pillar 2 or even by the laws that are coming out of Europe. And I think that is what I also try to highlight in my paper. The other operational difficulty I see is informal economy. Professor Raghi himself admits that he developed this idea of HRDD based on how multinational corporations are dealing with their supply chains. But many of the business actors in the global south, especially, but also I will say in Europe, are part of the informal economy. And those very small, informal micro businesses, I don't think they can follow Pillar 2, the prescriptive four-step elements of Pillar 2. For instance, if you're running a family-run tea shop in a village in India, how can this tea shop do the four-step due diligence process contemplated? Of course, there is a qualification in terms of you do it as per your size and all this. But how do you adopt a human rights policy which is approved at the highest level in the company? This is just a solo business. You don't have a website. You don't have any process. You can't hire any any consultants to do due diligence for you. So my humble submission is that HRDD, as it has been contemplated by Pillar 2, is not a suitable tool for many businesses which are part of the informal economy. And I think that is a serious operational limitation of what we're talking about today. And the laws that are coming out of Europe, they will not touch upon many of these actors who are part of the informal economy in the global south. The third and final limitation that I try to highlight in the paper is about the structural limitations of HRDD as a process. Somehow I have a feeling that businesses are able to superficially do HRDD. They can make a commitment that we are respecting UN guiding principles, and we are doing everything we can, but the business models which are inherently exploitative or irresponsible, they are continue to go as usual. Let us consider tobacco companies. So tobacco companies, in my view, they can never respect UNGPs, because the idea of UNGP's Pillar 2 is that you should be able to respect all internationally recognized human rights. How can a tobacco company ever respect right to life and right to health? Merely because tobacco companies are able to remove child labor from their supply chains, that does not make them compatible, operating in compatibility with UN guiding principles. What about the gig platforms? How can they, on the name of creating autonomy and flexibility for these people, really respect human rights? So what I'm trying to suggest here is that companies are likely to have a situation in which they will claim that they are respecting UNGPs, they are doing HRDD, but they will continue with exploitative and irresponsible business models. And at the same time, moreover, it is quite possible that those businesses will continue to create inequalities, economic inequalities. So HRDD is unlikely to question how much uh, salary the chief executive officer is making. So if a chief executive officer of a multinational is making 500 times more money than the average salary of a worker in that particular company, is HRDD going to question that? And if, on the other hand, some people argue that it should question that, then I would say that then businesses will not be able to do any business, because then the pillar 2 responsibility will become so rigorous, so difficult to achieve, that it will be almost impossible. They cannot just do business. Rather, they have to just keep on thinking about human rights all the time. So that was my critique in the paper about HRDD as a process and the legal addition of it. I'm not dismissive of HRDD completely, and I see that HRDD can serve some purpose. But to make it more effective, there are certain preconditions, in my view, that should be satisfied going forward. And that applies to whether it is the EU directive that is being discussed now, or it is about other countries, whether it is Canada or New Zealand or some other countries thinking about enacting a legislation of this kind. I will not have the time to go into details, but in my paper, I talk about 6 of these elements, that it should be holistic, cover not only human rights, but also environmental rights and climate change. And that is also very interesting that drafted in 2011, UNGPs completely ignore environmental rights. If you look at the language of principle 12, they don't mention environmental rights or climate change at all. Now, this issue, we cannot say it was not there in 2011. It was very much there. But of course, it's not part of the moral minimum at that particular point of time. So I think we need definitely more holistic human rights due diligence at this particular point of time. Uh, Now there's a lot of discussion to whom this responsibility or obligation should apply. And I think that is where it should apply to as many companies as possible, though I don't think it can be applicable to each and every company in the world because they just can't follow this obligation. Power imbalances, thirdly, must be addressed. Ideally, we should go beyond the process, and there should be certain red lines. In my paper, I give an example of Xinjiang province in China. So, how could a business do meaningful human rights due diligence in Xinjiang if it does not have the freedom to consult with the trade unions, with the workers, with the civil society organizations, and there is no free press? How can you do effective, meaningful human rights due diligence? What is the point of you operating there and pretending that you are acting in line with the UNGPs? And my last point is about access to remedy. So these are some of the 6 elements that I mentioned. Now, let me conclude by saying, and I then will welcome some questions and comments, and hopefully we can have some discussion. So what I believe is that HRDD as a concept in Pillar 2, as well as the legalization of HRDD in Europe, is definitely a good starting point. But perhaps we are obsessed with this concept, HRDD, and the legalization of it. We should be thinking about more tools to rebalance capitalism, if I can use the project title, Alyssa. And I will say just 3 points and I will conclude with that. First of all, we should perhaps, even if we want to use HRDD, and I'm just written another paper in which I articulate what I will call reimagination of HRDD. How should we reimagine? In my view, we should reimagine, instead of HRDD being done by companies or business consultants, it should be done by the rights holders. Indigenous people should decide whether a mining project should go ahead or not. And they should invite companies for consultation rather than companies inviting indigenous people for consultation. So that is the reimagination I have articulated in a paper that is going to be published. So if we really want this HRDD to work, it has to be people-centered and rights holder-centered. We have to take companies completely out of the equation. And of course, the funding for that HRDD done by rights holders has to be provided by companies because that is the cost of doing business. So they should provide the funding, and that will allow these rights holders to address power imbalances. And that's where pro bono lawyers, CSOs, trade unions, academia can assist them in doing that due diligence properly. So that is my one suggestion. And if we can reimagine HRDD in that sense, that may potentially be able to rebalance little bit of capitalism, because then companies will not decide how much they want to pay a worker in Bangladesh. A brand selling T-shirts in Europe will not decide how much this woman in Bangladesh should be getting for the T-shirt. Rather, that woman sitting in Bangladesh will decide how much she needs. And the consumers in Europe has to be responsible for that as well. My second point is that we need to reconfigure the very purpose of corporation. I think that has been lost. So unless we fundamentally change the very idea of business in society and the role of business in society, we are merely doing superficial tweaks through HRDD processes. We need to fundamentally change corporate law. We need to reconceive the whole idea of business. And I think it's not merely making money. If a business can ensure that the climate change is mitigated, or child labor is not there, and these children are able to have food and go to school, that is profit. That is profit not for the company, but that is a profit for the society. Because you are investing in the children who are going to be the future of the world. So we need to reconfigure the very purpose of corporation. And finally, we need to recalibrate the way we live. We, all of us, are responsible to some extent of the crisis that we're talking about, whether it is democracy or it is capitalism. Because nationalism and populism in democracy, or the lobbying that is happening, we are human beings. So when I teach business and human rights, and when I go and buy something in the supermarket, and when I'm talking to my children at home, am I behaving as the same person ethically, or am I behaving differently? These are the questions we should be asking. So how much we are eating and how much we are wasting? Are we sharing the wealth, or are we maximizing the wealth for our own purposes and all this? And I think we can keep on talking about it. For instance, housing has become a commodity. So the crisis that we are seeing is also because of us, because many people in the world have more than one house and they are renting those houses to make money. So this is not companies doing it. Of course, companies are part of the problem because they're giving you the loan to buy more houses. But when the house has become a commodity, when a water is being sold as a commodity, which is a natural resource, then we are talking about those wider systemic challenges. So in my view, we need to also reconfigure and reflect hard about us, each one of us, how we want to live this life and how we want to treat others in society, not merely other human beings, but also animals and plants and species. We'll stop at that. Thank you very much for the invitation once again, and happy to engage in any conversation and welcome any disagreements and critique as well. Thank you.